Hey guys, Louie here with Self-Inflicted Recovery, Redemption, and Life. Today is the evening of July 24th, 2019. I'm coming at you from Denver, Colorado. If you've been with me for a while, you already know a bit about me. My addiction ramped up when I was 16 to 17 years old. I used pretty hard for 17 years, lots of different things, but primarily cocaine, weed, and alcohol. I've been clean now for about 4 years. And as I got clean, I realized that my addiction caused a lot of pain, misery, and grief in my life. And it also caused pain and misery for those who cared about me. This podcast is an effort to share some of the things that I've learned and realized over the last several years. Even some things that I realized during my addiction. And my hope is that it helps people considering starting the journey towards sobriety. Or perhaps it'll help those who have already achieved sobriety to stay on that path. Or perhaps it'll help some of the normies out there to understand how things look from our perspective, since our behavior can seem to them pretty bizarre. If this is helpful, or you can relate, please feel free to share it with others. If you're listening on iTunes, please take a moment and scroll to the ratings and review section. Provide me a rating and write a review if you're so inclined. Doing these things will help to get this message out to more people. You can also see this on YouTube. If you're there, like, subscribe, comment, all that kind of thing. Also, it's available on Spotify. Also, I can be reached for contact, if you want to hit me with feedback, questions, ideas for topics, that kind of thing, etc. I can be reached via email at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. In this episode, I'm going to be talking a bit about happiness, what I know about it now, and how I viewed it before being sober. Now, full disclaimer, there will be some overlap in this episode. Part of the overlap will be from the first couple of episodes where I tell my story, and part of it will be from the episode where I talk about emotions and my theory on the purpose of emotions. Obviously, happiness is an emotion. It falls into that category. But I'm going to make an effort to cover this, and the idea here is that I confused happiness with numbness. And I'm going to explain how I've changed my strategy for achieving happiness as a result of getting sober. So, when I first started using, it made me happy. I started smoking and I started drinking at about 16 years old. That seems to be a common age for many of us. It started very slowly at first, and I had confidence issues and was pretty unhappy for a number of reasons. Mostly because I was always in trouble for behavior and for academic performance, and I didn't get a lot of positive feedback from my parents. Woe is me. Anyway, when I started smoking and drinking, I realized it made me feel good. It even made me feel happy, and I started doing it as often as I could. It was like being in a whole new and whole different world, where I wasn't constantly enveloped by this cloud of negativity. I wasn't constantly hearing all this negative self-talk, and that felt really good, to be relieved of that burden for once in my life. So at first, using seemed to make me happy, and I would use it to augment activities, make things that were already fun or good even better, camping, frisbee golf, going to the movies, playing video games, whatever. I noticed, though, that as time went on, it shifted. It shifted from being something that augmented good activities to being the focal activity. Sure, I'd play video games, but if I couldn't play video games, I'd be content to just stay home and get wasted and stare at the wall. Or what if I ran out of money? Well, then I'd sell the video games to buy weed and alcohol, and who knows what else. I guess what I'm saying here is that getting high, drunk, and otherwise altering my state of consciousness slowly replaced all these other activities. Like I said, it became a focal point. It became the major activity, the hobby, the thing to do at the expense of everything else. As things went on, I didn't feel as happy about using, or as happy when I would use. It'd pick me up a bit emotionally, but I wouldn't be the happy, jolly jackass that I was in the beginning. As this went on even longer, I wouldn't really be happy at all. I'd have to smoke and drink just to feel normal and not feel like I'm in a state of depression. And I would realize this, and it would prompt me to attempt to cold turkey stop every once in a while. And every time I would fail at it, and every time I would relapse, sometimes I'd make it a few hours, Sometimes I make it a day or two. I attribute this to a couple of different things. Over a long period of time, my drug and alcohol use fried out my brain's natural ability to produce chemicals, specifically dopamine, and that's what made me feel happy. In layman's terms, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I threw off the chemical balance in my brain by using so much, and it stopped naturally making the chemicals responsible for happiness. The only time it would make those chemicals is if I encouraged it to by using, and even when I would use, after a while, it would only make those chemicals in small amounts. So as addiction went on, for me, or at least myself, I tended to isolate. And the problem with that is that humans are a tribal animal. Traditionally, we have safety in numbers, so connecting with people makes us feel good, and that encourages us to form tight-knit groups. We used to form up groups and tribes to survive, and connecting with others, for example, having friends and people who care about us and that we care about, makes us feel good, and it's really a survival mechanism to encourage us to form up into tribes and groups. So when I started really using a lot, I isolated, and I lost connections with friends and with people who cared about me. And this was an absence of something that inherently made me happy. And basically I was giving myself one less reason to be happy by not having any close relationships with anybody. Also worth mentioning, I didn't really realize any of this until about a year into sobriety. Because at that time, my brain, it started operating normally again to an extent. I started making natural dopamine. I started making friends again. And I started discovering other things that made me happy. Now, this is some of the overlap from the episode where I talk about emotions. But emotions make it particularly difficult for us to get sober for a couple of different reasons. And like I said, I cover this in episode 7, but some of it does bear repeating. First thing I'd like to mention here, we've trained our brains to only produce the chemicals that make us happy when we introduce specific chemicals into our body. Depending on what you're addicted to, it could be, meth, heroin, cocaine, weed, alcohol, gambling, pornography, whatever. But this means that basically I was going to feel like complete shit emotionally and maybe even physically until my body was able to normalize and start producing dopamine naturally without chemical assistance. In other words, I was going to feel like shit until my brain adjusted to not using anymore. The other thing that I realized as I progressed along the journey was that in the beginning, my emotions were completely overwhelming. And it didn't matter what type of emotions. It could be happiness, it could be sadness, it could be anger, it could be grief, whatever. When those emotions hit, they were completely intense and overwhelming. So, I'll give you a real life example. Again, I potentially talked about this in episode 7. But when I got sober, I was working for this company, and we had an office of 250 cubicles, and there were only 5 or 6 of us in the office on a daily basis. So it was basically like a ghost town. And I could avoid everyone and keep a very low profile if I needed to, thankfully. So I was in my cube maybe 3 days into being sober. So I was literally day 3 or 4 with no marijuana, no alcohol, after 17 years of being drunk and high pretty much all day every day. And I was watching YouTube while working on some paperwork, quotes and contracts and things like that. And I had YouTube running in one of the corners of my dual monitors, and an ad came up between videos. There was a little girl and a puppy, and the little girl was happy to see the puppy, and the puppy was definitely happy to see the little girl. And the puppy ran into her arms and was licking her face, and she was giggling, and they were both happy. And, I'm a dog person. I have a little girl. All of that was just too much for me. I started crying like a baby. And it wasn't sad crying. It was happy and beautiful. So I was crying in response to that. Thankfully, because the office was so large and there were so few of us there, nobody noticed this or heard me crying. So 9 months into sobriety, I had a buddy of mine at work, and it was his son's birthday, 10 years old, and he was going to take his son to play paintball for his birthday, and he invited me. And I used to play a lot of paintball. And I went out and I purchased a marker, a gun, and a mask and all the equipment. And like I said, this was something I used to do before my addiction started ramping up. So we went out to play paintball and with my buddy and his kids and their friends, and I had an absolute blast. And I realized that this made me happy. And another thing that started making me happy was the fact that I was starting to make friends again, you know? And I hadn't had many friends for a very long time. And what friends I did have, those relationships were based on mutual use. In other words, the main reason we were friends was because we would use together, you know? So maybe a year and a half in, as my brain chemistry started to normalize, I started to feel happier and happier. And I started to reflect on things. Now that I was actually feeling happy, I realized that for a super long time, I'd been confusing happiness with numbness. I'd been confusing happiness with the absence of unhappiness. And those are not the same thing at all. In fact, before sobriety, strong emotions would trigger me to use. For example, if I got pissed off at somebody in traffic, or had a huge fight with my wife, or I missed out on a promotion, or got into it with my boss or a coworker, those strong emotions would spur me to use in order to shut down those emotions. So I didn't ever learn how to deal with them in a constructive and healthy way. So now that I was actually feeling happy naturally, without introducing chemicals into my body, I could tell the difference between what I was feeling now, which was genuine happiness, and what I felt before. What I felt before was actually numbness. I wasn't feeling anything. And let me tell you, feeling nothing, or feeling an absence of unhappiness, and being truly happy, those are two completely different things. Also, like the crying session with the advertisement on YouTube with the little girl and the dog, that made me realize that my emotional muscles, the muscles that we use to deal with emotions, those were atrophied. Meaning they were out of shape and weak as a result of not being exercised. So, in the beginning, I was very much unsure of how to handle those intense emotions. As I moved forward, though, I developed techniques and strategies for dealing with emotions. Those muscles got stronger, and now I have a tool belt full of tools to deal with all these emotions effectively. Before, I didn't have any need for tools to handle my emotions, because I was just able to turn them off at will by getting high or drunk. It was like an on-off switch, I suspect that's also why we as addicts are advised to not make any drastic changes in our lives in the beginning of our sobriety. Like major relationship changes, changing jobs, moving, things like that. I think that when you make major changes, a lot of times there are intense emotions that go along with that. And in early sobriety, we don't have the tools or the emotional muscles to deal with them. And that makes it easy to just relapse, because the only thing that we know to do when we have intense and perhaps overwhelming emotions is to turn them off by using. So I had this dog. I found her on the street when I was like 19 years old. We used to always be together and do all kinds of dirt together. When I was out running the streets, she'd be with me. When I'd go camping, go to the lake, she'd be with me. She'd go everywhere with me. She was my best friend. And I had her for something like 16 years. And we loved each other with all our hearts. Maybe a year and a half into sobriety, she got sick. I took her to the vet. They didn't really know what was going on, but they did know that, she was getting ready to pass away. And we knew this was coming because she was so old. And I ended up having to put her down. And it broke my heart. I wanted her to be comfortable and to not be scared. So I took the day off work, and I had the vet come to the house, and I held her in my arms, and they euthanized her. And it was one of the saddest things I'd ever experienced. But at this point, like I said, I was a year and a half into sobriety, and I was strong emotionally, and I had tools, and I had a support system, because I was going to meetings, and I was going to therapy, and I had friends, and I had people in my life who loved me and supported me. And, when she got put down, it hurt. I was a wreck for days and days afterwards. But as time went on, that pain and sadness eased and subsided. If I was alone, and I didn't have a support system, or if I didn't know how to deal with those emotions, In other words, if I were early on in my sobriety, I think there's a really, really good chance that I would have relapsed. Just to turn off all the sadness and all the pain with losing my friend. Now, don't get me wrong, it was sad, but I was able to express my sadness in healthy ways. I was able to talk about it with people, my wife, my kids, my friends, and that allowed me to process those emotions instead of turning them off with drugs and alcohol. I was so sad that when I was writing this episode, I actually started crying. I was also able to model healthy ways to deal with those emotions for my children. I showed my kids that it's okay to be sad when you lose a loved one, and it's okay to talk about your feelings and your emotions. Another amazing thing was this. I got Dee, the dog, when she was a puppy. I found her on the street, brought her into my life, and I was already well into my addiction when this happened. So she only knew me as an addict until the last year and a half of her life. And I had her for 16 years. But you could tell that she knew I was different in that last year and a half. She could tell there had been a change. And I was grateful that she saw that change and saw that I was happier than I'd ever been. And that was a great thing, because even though she's just a dumb dog, she had an incredible amount of love for me, and she always wanted the best thing for me. So it was really cool that for the last year and a half of her life, she got to see me the most happy I'd ever been. Now, this next comment I'll make here, it doesn't really have to do with addiction. This comment is about a boy and his dog. It made me truly sad when she passed away. I was a wreck for probably a week after. I would cry and stuff randomly. I would have gone, but the thing is, I would have happily gone through the pain of us being separated by death 1,000,000 times in return for the 16 years of love that we got to share together. It would have totally been worth it to go through it 1,000,000 times. Alright, on to another topic. This also has to do with happiness, but I'm letting you know that clearly I'm switching tracks right now. So a couple weeks back, I was talking to a buddy of mine, and he and I share a lot in common. We have a lot of the same interests and things like that. One of the things that we share is that we both work in corporate America, 2 different companies, and I'm kind of an intense guy. I always have all these crazy thoughts running through my head, and a lot of times they're things that I can't say at work. And this has always been a thing, and I've learned to just restrain myself and keep my mouth shut so I don't get fired from places. And there's also behavior that occurs to me that's unacceptable. But I still want to do these things anyway, just so that all these stuffy bastards know exactly who they're dealing with. But I can't do or say any of these things because, like I said, I'll get fired. It's one of the consequences of being uncivilized. You get fired. Well, this friend of mine, he's kind of the same way. He has to restrain himself constantly. And what we do is we call each other every day or so, and we say all the crazy things to each other that we want to say to people at work so we can get it out of our systems, but also not get fired for it. So we're talking about friendship, and somehow we get on the topic of happiness and how our friendship with one another makes us happy, and how some of the other things that we both enjoy make us happy also. And I realized that I wanted as many sources of happiness in my life as possible. And I explained it to him. I was like, man, I want my sources of happiness to be varied and diverse, like a good stock portfolio, So, back when I was using, there were pretty much 2 major things that counted for probably 80 to 90% of my happiness. One was getting high and drunk, which really just numbed me and made me not unhappy. The second was working hard and making money. The remaining 10 to 20% was my family, and sometimes that accounted for maybe less than 10% of my happiness. When I compare my happiness pre-sobriety to post-sobriety, and the things that actually make me happy, the things that I derive happiness from, I realize that now I have many, many more streams or sources of happiness. One of these sources is my friends. I have a rich life full of many different groups of friends. Sharing a fellowship with them makes me happy. And I feel good when we're able to help each other through life. Good friends, they support each other. And they help each other to deal with difficulties and disappointments in life. or even to share the good times and the good things that are happening. Another thing that I derive happiness from is paintball. I love that sport. Playing it's fun. I get exercise. I get to build and restore and modify paintball guns, especially old ones. Hunting down old parts and good deals, that's also a blast. I also watch a lot of wrestling. It's a blast to watch. And when I say wrestling, I'm not talking like Olympic or collegiate wrestling. I'm talking like Vince McMahon, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, WWF, WWE type wrestling. I also derive a lot of joy and happiness from my family. Spending time with my wife and children, the dogs, horsing around with them, sharing this wonderful journey with them. I enjoy working on this podcast and learning more about the audio side of things, learning more about addiction, learning more about my addiction and what's going on inside of me. I derive a substantial amount of joy from seeing my brothers and sisters in sobriety reclaim their lives. That is super rewarding. Work is fun. It's a challenge. But it's no longer my only redeeming quality like it used to be. I'm always having a good time learning new things, developing new skills, getting better at understanding technology, business, sales methodologies, all those kind of things. I also derive a great deal of joy from playing old retro games, like Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64 games. I read a lot of sci-fi books. I get comic books from time to time. And I've got enough of these diverse streams of happiness that I'm able to do some of these things every single day. Literally every day. So, what I'm saying here is that my happiness is a very deliberate thing. I make time to do these things every day, and it allows me to derive enjoyment from life. And this galvanizes my resolve to not use, because I know with 100% certainty that if I start using and I start going back down that path, at best, I get either emotional pain when I'm sober or a lack of unhappiness when I'm not sober, and neither of those things are true happiness. So, for those of you early on in the journey, just know that the emotions are going to suck in the beginning. They're going to be overwhelming. You might also have physical withdrawals depending on what your drug of choice was. But make sure you're working a program. You're doing something on a regular basis to stay sober. Get a support system, like-minded individuals who have acquired what you want. Therapy also helps because it can help you gather tools to deal with your emotions. Also, as you share things with others in sobriety, talk through your emotions. This will help you to gain tools. And the act of sharing your struggles with others, in and of itself, will help you to process and deal with those emotions in a healthy manner. It'll also help you to realize that you're not alone. There's other people out there with the same struggles as you. Also, make a conscious effort to find things that make you happy. Even if you have to make a list of things that might be fun and might make you happy, make that list and then start working your way down it until you find what brings you real joy. Once you find those things, make a deliberate effort to do some of those things every single day. Okay? Think about it this way. For a long time, you probably derived happiness avoided unhappiness by using. And now that you aren't doing that, you'll need to find other ways to spur and prompt your brain to produce dopamine. Without your brain producing dopamine naturally, I think the outlook in terms of staying sober looked pretty bleak. We all deserve to be happy. Alright, so time to wrap things up here. If this is helpful and relatable, share it with others. If you're listening on iTunes, please scroll down to the ratings and review section. Provide me a rating and a review. If you're listening on YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, blah, blah, blah. If you want to reach Louie, send me your thoughts, comments, feedback at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. Things you'd like me to possibly discuss, whatever you got, love to hear from you. Now, go get happy. That's all I got. Thanks, guys. Louie out.